Hello, everybody. Very excited to be here with a new webinar today talking about what it's like to be drinking from a fire hose in terms of the amount of accounts and data that we're going to need to manage as we go into 2021. I'm very excited to have Mr. Jeffrey Schaefer here from Unifund and RDS Recovery Decision Science, and also Mr. Walker White joining us from Oliver Technologies. As we go through our webinar today, I just want to make it clear to everybody that we will be answering questions, as many questions as we possibly can at the end of today's webinar. So feel free to leave questions in the chat box, and we will be getting to answer those at the very end of our session today. So now that we're kind of going to kick this off here, Jeff, do you want to give us a quick intro about yourself and Unifund in Recovery Decision Science?
Absolutely. Jeff Schaefer here. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Information Technology and Analytics at Unifund and Recovery Decision Science, based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and also adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati. And Unifund's been in the debt buying business now since the late 80s. We've been working as a debt buyer and buying portfolios for all that time. But about 5 years or so ago, we formed Recovery Decision Science, which is the technology and analytics of Unifund that we've used all of these years on our own book of accounts. And we've offered out servicing and products out to clients, banks, creditors, law firms, agencies, and so on.
That's fantastic, and I think that a lot of what Unifund and RDS does is going to become extremely relevant in this 2021 environment that we're going to be talking about here in terms of the influx of accounts. Walker, can you tell us a little bit about Oliver Technologies and a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Thanks. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to spend some time with both you and Jeff. My name is Walker White. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Oliver Technology Corporation. Oliver is a cloud-based software as a service collections litigation platform that automates and orchestrates the repetitive legal and regulatory processes to enable creditors and their law firms to increase revenue, maintain rigorous compliance, and really simplify the litigation process. Our customers include creditors, debt buyers, master servicers, and even law firms. Incidentally, Oliver was founded about 4 years ago as Logix Incorporated. At the time, we partnered very closely in our original development with a law firm called Logix Lawyers and large creditors to develop our solution. But about 9 months ago, we renamed Logix Incorporated to Oliver Technology Corporation, which is a hat tip or a reference to the very progressive Supreme Court jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., in order to remove kind of market confusion between the software company, Oliver, and one of the law firms we partner with, Logix Lawyers. So we're really happy to be here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Well, I'm very excited to have such qualified guests to be providing us with some information and kind of dissecting the situation that we're expecting to see over the coming months and over the coming years. So to kind of explain the analogy of drinking from a fire hose, and this is kind of a phrase that we hear frequently, but what we're referring to is ultimately with a massive increase in volume of accounts and maintaining the current capacity that exists within agencies and debt buyers today, we're all going to be drinking from a fire hose, and we're going to have to find ways to get kind of bite-sized pieces of information that enable us to increase our capacity and better manage the flow of accounts using data science, analytics, and technology to assist us through that process. So I think it's very exciting to have some really qualified people here to talk about this, because it's not a unique challenge, and I think this is something that pretty much everybody across the receivables management industry is going to be facing over the coming year. So with all that being said, Jeff, I know that you've got some incredible data analytics and some data points that we wanted to cover today, and talking a little bit about the impact of COVID on collections so far.
Yeah, well, you bring up some great points. I mean, we live in the world of data. Data's gathering, on us all the time as we move from point A to point B. Our phones, our purchases, our online activity, and everything, right? That just the data is the fire hose is a great analogy for that. In the collection world specifically, I think it's going to become important for us to look at the data, whether it's, historical data that we've had, like credit bureau data or account level data or things like that. But more importantly, leveraging, new technologies, new way of looking at that data. And I think that's what's going to help us as we move forward. As you talk about COVID, there's a lot of things impacting that have changed the dynamic in the world, both in good ways, I guess, and in bad ways. From an economic standpoint, we saw the unemployment rate reach, critical, just crazy levels in a very, very short period of time. And at the same time, you had the housing market hot as ever, with interest rates as low, historic lows on interest rates, and the refinance of homes is going crazy. The building of homes is going crazy. So, you have commercial real estate struggling, but you have residential real estate, at all-time highs. You have this, incredible spike. I don't know if you saw the New York Times, a couple of newspapers on the front page had the unemployment rate, and it went the whole, page, the spike in the unemployment rate. And then just as quick as it went up, started to come back down. So without a doubt, that has to affect your collectability of your accounts, if not for the short term, probably for the medium term as well. Then you have the stimulus package, right, where they put money in the hands of consumers, and people were voluntarily paying more than they would normally in a period of time. So that's unusual too. So I think we had a lot of varying factors, in the portfolio. When you look at the accounts, some areas of your portfolio probably outperforming what they would normally perform, and then other areas of your portfolio, you're wondering, what happened. And then the last complexity I'll throw out there is the courts. If you have a legal model, the court systems were closing down. The businesses were closing. The hospitality industry and the airline industry and the restaurant industries all got completely shut off, but nobody really thought about, well, the court system's closed, and you weren't filing new cases, and you weren't filing new garnishments, and so on. And so the system had halted for a period of time, which then when it opens back up, they have a huge backlog. So lots and lots of economic and other factors buried in there, and each one sort of has a plus and minus, right?
Well, I think that there's definitely an influx of volume coming, right? And I'd like to go back to the analogy of kind of what's going on within the housing market. And so from a landlord-tenant perspective, where evictions have been kind of pushed to the side for a period of time, when evictions start to turn on again, we're going to see a massive influx of volume coming from that area. And I think that applies to a lot of different other products as well, other credit products. And one of the most interesting things in the conversations that we've had leading up to this webinar today was a little bit about how you're taking some of this raw data and turning that into actionable intelligence. And I'm really excited to get into some of that material. Walker, as you've been kind of looking at the marketplace and the changes and your expectations for 2021, what are you seeing in terms of your predictions for the increase in charge-off volume?
Yeah, I think Jeff hit it right on the head. It's just been a very unexpected downturn, where you typically expect to see the unemployment rate go up, and then collections start to suffer from that. But as Jeff pointed out, right, the government intervention coupled with the lockdowns, people don't have a place to spend this money. They were voluntarily putting that money towards paying down debt, and so while that probably delays some of the impact on the market, I don't think the underlying market disruption is ultimately changed. So as we look ahead, into Q2 21 or Q3 potentially, it's difficult to say with the change of administration and everything. But even if we use 2008, 2009 as a guide, where defaults increased 2x from where we were, and I think it's safe to say that this situation is likely going to be larger than that one as we come ahead. So, kind of if I had to look into the crystal ball, and again, things can change with everything that's occurring literally today as it relates to the pandemic. I would say that wave, which we would probably, if the event was March of last year, we would be expecting to see now, has probably been pushed back, 6 to 9 months as a result of various interventions by government and businesses, voluntarily, pushing off payments and other things along those lines. So I think it's a very, very interesting market, but I think the underlying fundamentals are the issue still remains, and that's going to come out, whether it's Q2, whether it's Q3 of next year, and that drinking from a fire hose is going to be a very, very important point in being able to manage that.
We found an interesting pattern in the employment data. You say, oh, the unemployment rate went up. And so you figure, oh, your wage garnishments will be affected, or your new wage garnishments, or your existing wage garnishments, or contacting even people if they don't have a job, they don't have an ability to pay. Well, that's probably true for the airline industry and the hospitality industry and so on. But there's a lot of people, for example, Amazon was hiring, Walmart was hiring, Target was hiring, the U.S. Post Office, all these people that weren't losing jobs. That's an interesting, factor in there, that in some areas of the economy, it was growing, right? And so you can't just say, oh, the unemployment rate's going up. Another interesting, thing that we saw in our data, the unemployment rate was sky high for people who were, say, 18 to 25. And that makes sense, but that's not my consumer in my portfolio. That's not heavy to that. So, disproportionate areas and industries were affected in this particular downturn.
That's right.
So as we look at this kind of increase in volume, what do you see in terms of predictions of the collectibility of accounts? So if we're going to have more accounts in the marketplace, how do we feel that will, in the current environment, will affect the overall collectibility?
Right. Well, I could jump in on that one first, Adam. I think there are kind of two avenues to that. One is the propensity to pay side of that, which I think that Jeff is in a really good position to address. But there's another element to it, which is the channel by which we're going to collect that. And I think that the newest FDCPA ruling that came out from the CFPB is putting a much, much tighter leash on contact collections. And I recently was in a conversation with Stephanie Jackman of Ballard Spahr, an industry leader in this space. And she's really expecting that legal collections are really going to enter this very, very bullish period. Because of the constraints that are being put around kind of historical channels, and for creditors to effectively collect, they're looking at legal as more and more as the one that they can do, remain compliant, and ensure, of course, that they stay off the the top fold of the Washington Post while doing that.
Definitely an interesting approach to that. I can't say that you're wrong, right?
Right.
That's the channel that I think has the highest degree of confidence at this point, especially with rules in progress and potential changes in administrations, those types of things.
I think we'll have to find other ways to collect from those consumers too. We're in an industry where phone calls and letters are predominant, and at some point it's like, okay, well, what's going to happen after you call that person 100 times? Like, what enough is enough, right? Like, at some point it's too many calls and it's too many letters, whether it's a dozen or 2 dozen or 100. There has to be some other mechanism. One of the things we've been focusing on, are other ways to do that. Give other ways for the consumer to connect with us and ways to pay, other than just having to rely on the legal channel or the non-legal, calls and letters.
That's right.
Understood. So as we're kind of setting the stage for what we expect the environment to be in 2021, I did have one other question that I wanted to kind of have you guys address for me, and that's about fighting the clock. So as we're dealing in a situation where basically you're going to have so much volume and you're going to be fighting the clock from a statute of limitation standpoint, both in terms of accounts that had already charged off, that purchased either pre or during the COVID process, where maybe the courts weren't open or your standard kind of litigation channels weren't available, but also looking at with this influx of volume that we're expecting in 2021 and into the future. How do you kind of see that problem, and how are you evaluating that situation within your own organizations?
Yeah, I can go first on that one. I think, that hasn't been a major issue in the past few years, just from the standpoint of debt is being sold quicker. In the past, I guess, if you go back 10 years ago, older portfolios were being sold where, the amount of time that you had was critical. And these days, a lot of portfolios are being, fresh at charge off or after one or two agencies, and that time hasn't really ticked by. Now you do bring up a good point, Adam, with the courts. If the courts are shut down, now some statutes have told the statute of limitations while those courts are down, and others not. We haven't had, thankfully, the courts were only shut down for a short period of time, and most of them open back up. Maybe we end up in second round, closures. But so far, I haven't been really worried about the time. It goes back to, I think, the processes of, if you're working with that data, upfront, making good decisions and can do that quickly, and I say quickly, maybe in 90 days or 120 days, you can figure out what you're going to do with those accounts through the data process. Then you can get ahead of that. You don't feel like you're running up against a deadline of a court.
Okay.
That's right. And I'd add on to that. We certainly saw in places like California, when they shut down the courts, that they basically extended the statute of limitations on things on an amount that was equivalent to the amount that the courts were closed. But then there's an enormous backlog that comes up behind that you're kind of always running up against. But I think there's another aspect of this, and Jeff touched on it a little bit, which is that you can change the clock a little bit. You can't get more time, but you can utilize the time that's given to you much, much better by, bringing technology to bear on that, to be making better decisions about, what files are suit worthy and what files should be, collected through another channel. So it's not something we can ever get that time back, but I think automation and technology ensures that we use the time that we do have at our disposal in a much more efficient manner.
Excellent. Well, that definitely makes me feel a little bit better, because that was one of those kind of burning questions that I've had about this entire situation. More volume, less time. Like, how are we dealing with that? And I think that we're going to cover, a lot of material today that actually it talks about how to execute on some of these ideals. So, and now that we've kind of set the stage for what our expectations are for 2021 and kind of what we're seeing in the marketplace from our unique positions in our own organizations, let's talk a little bit about kind of, if we're dealing with an influx of volume, increasing capacity is always a factor, right? And looking at what we can do to be increasing that capacity. And I know, Walker, that's something that you guys have a lot of concentration on within your platform. So let's talk a little bit about, kind of that simplification process. If I'm a debt buyer and I'm in the litigation space and I'm going to need either more attorneys or more coverage of more areas in a short period of time, what does that kind of look like, and what can I be doing to simplify my process for onboarding these attorneys while maintaining the highest level of compliance that I expect from every service provider that I work with?
Right. Yeah, and I think the onboarding process is, their internal, the means by which a creditor or a debt buyer may onboard a law firm are kind of controlled by them. But one of the things I think we're really focused on from a compliance standpoint is, how do we ensure that we can codify, if we're going to be automating these processes, how do we codify all the laws, rules, and procedures at the federal, state, county, and sometimes even venue-specific level into a compliance framework that ensures that all matters pass through the legal process and get the checkbox for having done that properly? And I think a really good analogy of this is to think about TurboTax, right? The US tax code is about 4,000 pages, and then there are another 65,000 pages of descriptions of how to use it and so on. However, the tax code has been codified by the likes of TurboTax and others, such that anyone can quickly and accurately file their taxes. And we basically take a very similar approach to collections litigation, is that we know what all the rules are at the federal, state, local, and venue-specific level. We codify that information in there and ensure that those law firms that we're bringing on are working within that compliance framework, and that removes a lot of risk that comes from compliance from that standpoint. So it really helps to kind of accelerate that process because those laws, rules, and procedures are built in.
I would jump in and say the other point that I think resonates with me is putting the right person in the right channel. And that's where the technology for us comes into
Right.
play is, if you people think that you're buying these portfolios where people owe money, that we're thinking of them as deadbeats, or that they're all upside down financially. There's different reasons for why people didn't pay those bills. And when we look in the portfolio, I can find people that have $1 million homes and are still living in them, right? And owe some kind of credit card debt or something. And there's a variety of reasons for all of that. For us, it's about finding the people that have the ability to pay, and targeting them in the right channels, so that if I had access to the unemployment data, I'd love that, right? I could weed out all the people that are unemployed and say, don't sue them, right? They don't have a job. Those people need help. They don't need debt collectors chasing them. But there's another subset of the accounts, and if you're using the technology appropriately, it's really about finding the people who do have that ability to pay, that aren't upside down, didn't lose the job, aren't on Medicare or disability. You're really trying to find the people that have the ability to pay, and optimizing, to what Walker said, you optimize the process, you optimize the data. You're then focusing on subsets of accounts as opposed to just drinking from the fire hose again, right?
Right.
Sure. Sure. And I think that follows, pretty much what I think we would expect, right, in terms of increasing capacity. But, one of the things that we've kind of talked about here, as we've kind of gone through this process of drinking from the fire hose, is talking about suit selection, right? And so if we're going to have this much more volume of accounts, and we're going to be seeing this much more data flowing through, what can we be doing to improve our pre-suit selection processes? Like you said, we can't sue everybody. We don't necessarily have access to the unemployment data to filter out from that perspective. But what do we have, right? What can we be working with?
Yeah, well, we have what Walker said. You have jurisdiction data. What states you can and can't garnish wage. You have other law data exemptions and things like that. So there's the law piece. So that's the structure, right? That's built into the systems. Then there's the consumer data. That you want to know about the consumer itself. Is this consumer better than another consumer? And we can do that with all kinds of things. We can in the old days, you would think of a credit score rates those people, right? And one credit score is higher than another, that person's better. In our world, that doesn't really work, right? Everybody's got kind of bad credit scores if they didn't pay their debts. But there's other tools and analytics that you can use on that. You can figure out based on where they are, and take data such as their address. Something simple as their address. You say, well, what does that tell you? Well, you can analyze their home for various things. What kind of home is it? What's the quality of that home? What's the value of that home, and things like that. So, we've in the last few years focused a lot on machine learning, deep learning algorithms that, just didn't exist 10 years ago. So we can do things today that will help us identify those accounts quicker, faster, and more accurately, to get to those gems, if you will, the people that have the ability to pay in a portfolio, that if anybody, even on the front page of the New York Times, looked at that person and said, well, yeah, I don't understand why that guy didn't pay his credit card bill. Look at the house he's living in.
Yeah.
And so
Sure.
it really gets you to better decisioning up front, to the right people at the right time quicker.
Yeah, I think that Jeff hit it right on the head. It's really critical to identify kind of early and often those with a propensity to pay, and then once they actually move into, for example, the legal process, we just want to make sure that coming back to the compliance aspect of, or the litigation process of it, that we move that through that in a very, very efficient manner, yet maintaining all of the compliance. Returning meaningful involvement, the ability to audit, what's being done and when it's being done. And I think that, collections firms that are staffed kind of historically are really going to have to kind of find ways to automate that to be much more competitive. But in these solutions where we can bring up, for example, imagine an attorney that's reviewing documents against, a legal pleading against, the materials that they've got, the ability to have them be able to do that on a very, very timely basis, quickly, make any modifications right in a platform where they can just compare those things side by side and then move it through. They're going to be grabbing that meaningful attorney involvement and keeping it going through the process and pass any audit or compliance requirements they'll be through. But ultimately, we're moving the files much more quickly, which of course is essential to the fire hose analogy again.
Well, and that also goes back to, kind of looking at the statute of limitations, right?
Right.
And the challenges that we're going to face from a timing perspective can be ultimately addressed by moving a little faster. And moving faster, tends to include some automation.
That's right.
But as we kind of wrap up the segment here, talking about the increase in capacity, I know one of the things that I've looked at in the past, and actually done some in the past, is that as we have an increase in volume, or we've made larger purchases that our network can handle, things of those nature, we've started to look at master servicing as an additional option. Is that something that you guys think is going to become an even larger portion of a debt buyer strategy going forward into 2021?
Yeah, I don't know about the debt buyers themselves, but certainly in the industry, I think that's going to be a trend. Whether the larger public debt buyers move in that direction, I don't know. They don't seem to be, but certainly the creditors, certain creditors have more infrastructure in place over the years than others. Big name credit card retailers have been. They have litigation accounts, they have attorneys, an attorney network, they have collection agency networks, and so they certainly leverage that. Others maybe had a different strategy and need to build that out. I think the master servicer comes into play for a couple of reasons. One, that it's turnkey, right? So somebody doesn't have those strategies, they can just walk in and start on day one and say, okay, well, rather than trying to build this and Walker will tell you, you try to build it, you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, right? You don't know the processes, you don't know the laws, you don't know the workflows, all those things that you don't have, you're going to fumble through, as you get there if you've never done it before. So I think the advantage of having a legal servicing or master servicing to handle that is that it is turnkey. It's one-stop shop. All your compliance is in one place. All of your auditing is really held to one place. And then that servicer can do those other things for you. So I think that is a strategy that will be useful to certain creditors in 2021.
Understood. So, now that we've kind of covered some of the things that we can be doing from an increasing capacity standpoint, now I want to talk a little bit more about optimizing the efficiency of the process and kind of what that looks like. Because if we've got kind of two main ways to deal with an influx in volume, one is be able to handle more capacity, and the other is, like we've talked about a little bit, is do better with what you have in front of you. Those accounts that you select that you're going to move forward on with litigation, what are you going to do to improve or unlock additional value from those? So I guess let me start off by asking the question, as we look at 2021, we look at new data sets and all these other things that are now available to us. How do you envision unlocking more value and more hidden assets from the accounts that are selected for litigation?
Yeah, I think in two ways. It really comes back to that get the right segmentation in the beginning, the right accounts in the right channel. So leverage the technology and analytics to find the people who have the ability to pay. You almost could think of in a bucket of ability to pay, but may just be avoiding it, right? Not responding or just ignoring it. And they could be living in that $1 million house and just saying, yeah, I'm just not going to pay it. Then you have maybe the other side of the coin is somebody would love to take care of their debts. They just don't have the income. Maybe they're making $15 an hour and they don't have the ability to pay it off, but they have a want, right? Those are completely two different strategies to handle that account, and trying to treat them, respectfully and put them down the appropriate channel, I think is key. And that is easy to do if you look at two accounts. May not be so easy when you're looking at hundreds of thousands of accounts and trying to figure that answer out and put them all in the right buckets, right? That's where the technology and processes come into play.
Understood. So, as we kind of talk about unlocking the assets, I think another thing that we're going to want to understand is basically working with our service providers to kind of audit them and figure out what they're doing to unlock the value, that falls into kind of their realm of responsibility. So, Walker, I know this is something that kind of your platform does and something that you guys have been involved with. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can be improving our firm oversight and optimizing the efficiency within the service providers we're using?
Absolutely. And again, this is just essential. And I don't think that, well, I don't think anyone would believe that oversight in this area is going to decrease. It's only going to increase, particularly as more and more consumers are in this bucket. CFPB is going to be hanging over that much more closely, and not just the creditor, the originator, if you will, particularly the originator if it's a bank or something, but the firms themselves. And so I think what we're seeing from our customers is a much deeper interest in the audit trail, like not just to the firm, but to the third and fourth parties that are working on those. So, for example, a creditor might want to look down into a particular matter or tranche of matters and see information about the process server or even information about the mailings, and that providing that level of transparency can really only be enabled through technology. Rather than phone calls, like, what about this matter? Did you mail it? Did it get served, and so on and so forth. It's only technology that's going to give them that deep insight into this to make the owner of that debt be comfortable that we're following all the laws, rules, and procedures that need to be in place, and confidence, if you will, in that channel.
Sure. So, as we're talking about kind of managing those channels and managing that information, real-time analytics has become something that is increasing in importance because, again, with shorter time periods, we need to stay more on top of things, keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the real-time account management, portion of that and kind of the value that a creditor can find, with that type of information.
Yeah, on the front end of a portfolio, you're relying on models, formula, mathematical algorithms, deep learning, machine learning. That's your account selection. But to talk about what you're talking about now, that really, in my mind, is business intelligence. That's where your technology layers over on top of for dashboards to monitor your business. Whether a complaints dashboard, for example, in our company. We developed a complaints dashboard, and we look at it once a month with a committee of people that say, how are we doing handling the complaints that are coming into the organization? And we look at our open complaints, we look at our closed complaints, we can look at the volume of complaints over time. We can look at it by state and filter it down by state. We can look at it by type. Is it a CFPB complaint? Is it a consumer complaint? And so on. So the compliance piece that Walker talked about, you're definitely not going away. It's top of mind for everybody, whether you're servicing accounts for somebody else or you're buying accounts for your own. That is a very important piece. But whether it's in the compliance or the processes, I think that business intelligence layer, layering over top of it to be able to get to your data quickly, a view of your data quickly to tell you where things are, how are they moving, where things are going, and if something's not moving, here's something stuck or here's a problem. And there's an old analogy we love to use in our company. It's called runners, repeaters, and strangers. Runners just run down the process line. There's no issue with them. Repeater is something that it gets stuck and it has to repeat a process. You put it out for service and you can't get service, so you have to try again and you have to try again. And then there's strangers, and that's something that falls out of the process and requires care. It's a counterclaim, or it's a CFPB complaint, or it's something that a lawsuit that really needs to be tightly monitored. And you have to think about your accounts in that way, right? Like all accounts aren't equal. Some require more attention, and you have to be able to find them and attend to them.
Right.
So
I would just add to that I think that Jeff touches on something very important on the business intelligence layer, which is to be able to see that the matters that are moving kind of in aggregate. But I think there's another element to this, which is it's a garbage in, garbage out problem, right? Reasonable people presented with the same information tend not to disagree, but we've got to get the same information coming up. And this is where I think that at the atomic level, right, at an individual matter, once those ground rules are understood, it's really quick. It's important to kind of keep these things moving quickly, and that we're not losing cycle time between, the creditor or debt buyer and a law firm where they're, in standard communication channels. There's this kind of litigation, if you will, master record where all the parties can be operating on it at the same time, allow for a really dynamic interaction to quickly address issues. So, for example, our customers use dashboards to get an overall view of their matters progressions. Yet they look at that data, as Jeff was saying, for signals in that area, like in that pipeline, where are the blockages in that pipeline? But then being able to dig into it at a matter level and see if, like, hey, is this a systemic issue with our process, or is it a repeater or a stranger, right? And reducing that cycle time by having all of the parties collaborating on a single platform, I think, is key to kind of keeping the engine running, which is feeding that kind of business intelligence layer of where those things are progressing.
So just to make sure that I'm understanding this, and actually I love that analogy, and I think that's quite spot on. But so just so I can kind of recap that, we're talking about leveraging KPI dashboards that are identifying the outlier situations so that we can address each kind of segment of those types of accounts, right? So if you're taking your accounts and you're breaking them down into these three segments, we've got our runners that are just going to run through our process. We've got our repeaters, and we're going to identify where things are getting stuck within our processes. But then we're also going to identify those outliers that require white glove treatment, so to speak. And it seems like a very positive way to approach that type of a problem, right? So if you're applying the technology and looking at the numbers is one thing, but this to me is where you're turning raw data into actionable intelligence. And that really is kind of a key factor. I think anytime that you're trying to assess massive amounts of data, you need to do it in a way in which you're able to kind of address that modification from raw data to actionable intelligence, because that's where the value is in the actionable items that you can draw from this. So as we kind of talk about that, and I know we've talked about the application of analytics and kind of portfolio segmenting, is there anything else that you guys would like to kind of add to that part of the discussion?
Well, I'd just say you're near and dear to my heart. So near and dear. I'm the co-author of the book, the Big Book of Dashboards, and wrote the book on it. That is right in my wheelhouse of what I think you summed it up, Adam. You need to monitor your conditions of your business in some way, whether it's your key KPIs, your key performance indicators. And monitor those, and then design that in a way that you're getting fast information to the right people who can look at it and make it actionable. I mean, Walter brings up the point is it's great to know about it, but then once I know about it, I need to be able to act upon it, right? So if I have 5 open complaints and they're a month old, and I need to be actionable on it, well, then what's the next step and leading to it? So I think that's the key to all this, is designing that the workflow is there, the visualization of the process is there, and then having the actionable step outside of just knowing about it, right? It has to be actionable for sure.
Absolutely.
That definitely sounds like a book I need to be reading. So I'll be looking that one up shortly after we finish filming today. So, with all of that being said, and now that we've got we've covered some of the basics here in terms of increasing our capacity and how are we going to create a more efficient environment for us to be successful, which I think is an important part of this discussion. But kind of the next thing that I want to leave our listeners and viewers with here is going to be, how can we help them to build their litigation toolbox, right? So we've talked high level about some of these items, and I'd like to get a little bit more out of the strategic and into the tactical side, where we can talk about kind of how people can draw from some of the things that we've talked about here today and take them to the next level. So for example, here, we've talked a lot about data analytics, and, let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the criteria that viewers should be looking at when selecting a data vendor. Like what should I be considering? What should my criteria be as I'm looking for new data to include in my processes and new vendors to get that data from?
I can jump in there first.
Yeah.
Sure. What's interesting is you ask any organization if they use analytics, they say, yeah, we're very analytical, right? And that could mean an Excel spreadsheet, right? And that's how they run their numbers.
Sure.
So it's there's no shortage of vendors out there. Vendors all in our industry specifically resell a lot of data. So a vendor will sell somebody else's data. Sometimes they'll improve upon it or not. So very common. I think what's important is to know what you're looking for, test, find a trusted partner. You're going to get a lot of bad information. So trying to get, just something simple like a public record homeowner. It sounds simple, but it's not as simple as that. And so finding out the pitfalls in that, again, it's like what Walker was talking about earlier, these processes. You can go try to figure it out all on your own, but partnering with somebody who knows how to do it will get you there quicker, and you won't go through all those pitfalls of those things. So that's what I would say on the analytics side, is a lot of bad data out there, meaning inaccurate, and lots of people reselling information, and then knowing what information you need to make the right decisions. And I think we're in, whether you're talking about legal processing or suit decisioning or collection scoring, it's in my opinion, it's very bespoke. Every company is different. They're on a different, they do something different. They have a different life cycle. They get different data, or they're more advanced than others. So I think each one, probably needs something a little different.
Right. I would add on the data vendor side, and I think Jeff hits it very well there about, first and foremost, we got to talk about the accuracy of the information, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? So that like that's kind of step one. But coming from it at this problem from a software perspective, there are other things that we look for in the vendor as well, which is how quickly, how can we integrate with them, and do those integrations allow us to do things faster? And I'll give you a really good example of this from our own platform. We integrate with a mailing vendor, not necessarily a data vendor, but the mailing vendor, same idea, where when a letter gets a return to sender, right, as opposed to the law firm having to wait for that letter to actually come back and say, oh, it's been returned to sender, we get a code from the US Post Office that says return to sender. The actual letter may not be returned to sender for another week or 2 weeks, but based on that code, we can take immediate action and be like, okay, yeah, we know it's a bad address, it's returned to sender, move it on to a skip trace or whatever's next in that process. And that's where as I was talking about earlier about time, we've only got so much time. And by using technology, we're using that time much, much more efficiently. And I think we see the same thing across other data vendors, whether it's, Scrubs or employment, so on and so forth. Not only are we looking for really good data, but we're looking for mechanisms that they provide us technically that allow us to shrink the time and increase the velocity of the matters.
And I'd expand, it's just more than just data vendors, as Walker was saying, even your attorneys, your attorneys and your collection agencies, you have to get data back from them. We, 15 years ago, we had, great attorney who was, doing really well for us, but he was paper, everything was on paper. And that just doesn't work today. You can't be compliant in today's age and operate at any kind of volume without having the technology piece of being able, I need to know what's the status on that account. Is there something going on with it, whether it's in the collection agency channel or the legal network or whatever. So that data connection that Walker's talking about is super important.
Yeah, it's funny. I came to the collection space, from the software world, and very kind of speeds and feeds technology. And when I arrived here and I found out about kind of the standard data exchange format, which was this EDI file, a technology built in the 60s to be used in the 70s and still being used in 2020. I was stunned by that. And so that's why at our technology level, we're building modern APIs, resilient APIs around to make sure the data is coming in and going. And waiting 24 hours for a cycle time to send a file via SFTP, I'm just, guys, we're banging rocks together trying to make fire. There are better ways to move this information around. So let's do it.
So data transfer sounds like that's at the very top of the list, being able to push that data back and forth. And I agree. I mean, as a consultant in this space for many years, that's always one of the biggest issues that people are facing is how are you moving data back and forth? Because it's not all one type of data, right? You're moving spreadsheets and files and databases and that kind of data. You're moving media documentation, so account statements and other associated documentation, legal paperwork, contracts. I mean, there's just so much that's being transmitted back and forth. And quite frankly, at this point in 2020, if somebody gives me their fax number, chances are we're probably not doing business together.
I mean, the craziest example, this is not too long ago. I mean, we're not talking about 20 years, but a creditor, would send documentation. They go into their system, get the documentation, print it to paper, put it in an envelope, send it to us, which we scan and put back into a computer. You're like, something's wrong here, right? Like you took it from a computer to paper and then put it back in a computer. Like it's
what
doesn't
could
feel like
go
an
wrong
efficient method at all, right? And that's exactly it, right? Everything goes wrong. The more moving parts that you have and moving data,
Exactly.
the more things that can go wrong ultimately. So now that we've kind of talked about what to look at, from that perspective, and one of the things that I always like to tell people when they're looking at data vendors is test it, test it, test it. And then when you think that you have your solution in place, go and test that again. And so since I have two such qualified people on today's webinar with me, what I wanted to try and talk with you guys about for just a few minutes is establishing a test, right? Because so many times I start talking with an organization and I tell them, go test this data vendor or go test that software platform or go test this or that. And they come back and go, oh, well, I looked at it and it looks great. I saw their demo. And I said, well, is that really a test, right? Like, what are the elements of a good test when it comes to testing our data or testing our software? Like, what are those elements? What kind of a time period should we be looking at? Because 30 minutes on a demo is not really a test, right? Like, that's a demonstration, and then you have to build a test out to it. And so, like, what can we be doing to kind of draw some lines in the sand, establish our control groups, those kinds of things? How do you guys build a test when you're going to try something new?
Right. Well, I'll kick it off, Jeff. I mean, and I think this starts with, before we're testing something, we're falling back to kind of the requirements of what we're after, right? What we have to know what we want to test, basically. And when I think of, like, what should we be looking for from the vendors, right? I think that this day and age, number one, collaboration between the parties, right? You've got to be able to put the creditor or the debt buyer, the firm, the data providers, the processors, the appearance counsel, everyone is involved in the litigation channel on the same platform. LinkedIn today is an application where people who want to work together can come together and collaborate. Litigation is an environment where people have to work together to achieve a goal. So why aren't we using a solution that way? The second thing then for me is the flexibility, right? To understand that there is a compliance framework, if you will, of laws, rules, and procedures by federal, state, and local that we all have to work within. But within that, we want to make sure that we don't lose the, if you will, the art of litigation, right? Different strokes for different folks, right? There's not entirely science, but we can kind of practice that art form within inside that compliance framework. And the last thing I think we're really looking for is the visibility, right? That we talked about a little bit earlier, Adam, which is basically be able to see through the entire process from the creditor down to the process server and so on. So when we understand what those elements are that we're looking for, then we start to build our test cases. And I think that, to your point, a 30-minute demo is not going to answer this question. You've got to see an end-to-end user story or end-to-end process from, okay, I've got a matter I want to place. I want to see what's going to look like moving all the way through this process. And that's just good software testing, good requirements gathering, and good execution against that, which is, there are a lot of books written on that about the way to properly test environments. But I think you're right that, unfortunately, sometimes, a single screenshot or something can sell, or a single flashy dashboard might really sell. But really, this is about moving a lot of data through a very, very complex but finite process, and being able to bubble out of that the outcomes that we want, which is, of course, maintaining compliance, increasing revenue, and just simplifying that channel.
Yeah, I guess, statistically, very easy to define, say, what are we testing and how are we going to define success? And then, you operate in a vacuum. That's right. That's great. The problem is it never operates in a vacuum. And so business is messy, processes change, time goes by. So, it's really hard. People say, oh, we're going to do an A/B test. Well, they'll test vendors, but they'll test them at different times. If I test one vendor in January and then I go test the same set of accounts, with another vendor in June, 6 months passes, that makes all the difference in the world and could mess up the test one way or another. So We often try to hold out accounts for things that we do for treatments. We'll hold out a 10%. So that we have a group as it moves through the pipeline, and we can always go back and say, hey, how'd that 10% holdout do? When we test vendors, we have to be clear as to, are we testing them as an add-on strategy, or are we testing them as a parallel strategy? If it's an add-on, then I'm testing the lift. What lift am I going to get after I add on B to C to D? What's the lift look like? If I'm doing a parallel strategy, well, then I need to make sure the pools are as close to as comparison as I can be, to get a true, champion challenger, if you will, because otherwise again, it's going to be messy and not a true comparison. So,
Right.
there's entire courses at UC on this exact thing, just because there's so many ways of looking at that and doing it right. But I think the most important thing, working with people you can trust with that process or that data, because there's so many people out there that aren't doing it, and then they should be able to help you structure that test. Any vendor that you're using ought to be able to sit down and say, okay, well, I want to test your data. How would you test it, right? I often get like retro test questions. People want to take the score and score it in the past and see how it would do in the past, and that doesn't always work. So ask the vendors and the processors, how would you define a test, and see what they would say.
I think that's a great point, Jeff. And it also, and again, it's a little bit, I'm not totally altruistic reasons, right? As a software vendor myself, but asking a customer asking the vendor how they would test their own solution is incredibly revealing. If they're like, oh, we'll do a 30-minute demo, it'll be great, right? That, like big red flag. If they're like, look, I think the best thing we should do here is we should, potentially look at an entire state. Let's take, some subset of files. We're going to run them through an entire state so you could see that whole thing cradle to grave, what it means. It will be very, very revealing of what the their number one, their confidence in the solution, and whether it's really is this a mile wide and an inch deep, or do we really have a deep solution here for solving a problem?
I like that answer, right? Because the idea that that a 30-minute demo is going to tell me anything about a process or a data tool is really just not true. And then I also really like what you were saying, Jeff, about kind of looking at the different types of tests that you can run, and from a statistical analysis perspective, I realize that there's a couple different ways that we can attack the testing and those kinds of things. But what I've seen in the marketplace is not enough groups really give a fair shot to a new potential data vendor when they're setting up their test, and they're sending over either things that they couldn't collect through their standard channel and not giving it a true and honest test. And I think if our viewers walked away with something today in terms of the testing, it would be to try and have as much of a neutral lens as you can when you're looking at the results of testing and how you're ultimately going to set up any given test, whether it be for a software provider, for a data vendor, whatever the case may be. But you really have to, kind of break off a subset, whether it be 10%, 15%. I would say 10% on the smaller side of a statistically valid sample, but anywhere from that, let's say 10 to 20%, where you've got kind of you're able to challenge it against, or that champion challenger term that we all love so much in the space. Kind of looking at the comparisons there and how we can ultimately manage that process. So if we were going to walk away today, and I would encourage those of you that are kind of viewing and watching today, we're going to, we've got about 10 minutes left here in our hour block, and we're going to open up to questions here, both within the chat window and within our conversational string on LinkedIn here today. So I invite all of you that are watching to ask some specific questions. I mean, we've got some really smart guys here today that have a unique perspective on our industry, on our data, and the challenges that we're going to be facing over the next 12 to 18 months in terms of drinking from a fire hose with this massive increase in volume and potentially an increase in the collectability of accounts as well. So I just want to take a minute and thank both of you for your time and attention today. I'm really excited to have been invited to kind of moderate this panel because you guys are both very sharp in your own respective areas. And I'm very excited to see what kinds of questions we're going to get from our audience today and to hear your direct responses. So thank you guys so much for your time today.
Thank you. Great to be here with you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Adam and Jeff. Always great to chat. So
Yeah.
look forward to it.
Awesome. Well, we're going to start taking questions now and we'll jump right into it.